What I do want to talk about, though, today is around the idea of open learning analytics and personal learning graphs, which is something that I guess I've actually been complaining about for a few years now. And so it's really sort of revisiting that type of an idea. Now, let me just quickly go back here. There we go. So if you can just confirm, or somebody can smile or nod or wave vigorously, but you should see my slide up on the screen. If not, then please interrupt with audio. But okay, I see vigorous waving. Thank you. So the thing I'd like to look at here over the next 17 minutes is this idea of an open learning analytics platform. And it's actually based on a paper that I wrote with a few colleagues about 4 years ago now. Parts of it, we've made some progress on it, and I expect this next year will be quite a significant point of advancement on it. And more recently, the idea of personal learning graphs. And I think both of these systems should be open, which in many cases they currently aren't. And I think part of the challenge that we face here is that data has become a transactional entity like money. And that means that we use it in a similar way. We use it to exchange for things. So if we use, for example, Facebook without fee, we're essentially paying with our data, because Facebook in turn can monetize that. And this is hardly new to anyone. But what it does do is present us with a little bit of a challenge in that we are facing a lack of understanding of the value of this asset. But it is an asset, and it's an asset that's being used by organizations, by schools as well, by governments, by a range of different providers, some less than stellar motives, others just perfectly fine motives, but it's essentially using data is being used as a means to get at a number of things, or to buy a number of insights into each of us as individuals. And you start to look at the development of a range of different personalized computing tools. The Quantified Self is a movement I've been tracking closely over the last 3 to 4 years, as it provides some interesting insight. And this is only now ramping up as we're starting to see the use of wearables and related technologies become more prominent in society, and as the Internet of Things, for example, picks up steam as well. So there's a lot of data that we're collecting and generating, and as a result, these assets are being contested because they're economically valuable. One of the areas that has really helped to drive the education landscape over the last 4 years prominently has been the development of Moocs. So hardly a surprise for an event like an Open edX University's convening. You're all familiar with this. The growing attention to Moocs and the use of Moocs in different university systems has produced really quite a remarkable interest in learning sciences or in advancing research into learning. Most of this is driven by some level of data collection. Now, that data is quite often very rudimentary. It's log data. It might be data that we capture through as individuals navigate multiple systems. We may do some rudimentary profile development by looking at student information system data and so on. But by and large, our data scope is limited. But even then, we've managed to get a good amount of insight from the types of data that we do have access to into what actually happens in the learning process. What are some design implications for video length? What are some implications for the type of pedagogical practices that we engage in, such as using social interactions or community-oriented group work or problem-based learning and so on. So we're already seeing, just by having access to this type of data, not even at a sophisticated level, that we're getting significant insight from a research perspective. And so that's one of the reasons why data and as an asset, and an asset as a contested entity, starts to become a critical concern for us, because in many instances, even though there's been a good amount of progress initially with the educational data mining community, which I believe has been around for likely 8 years now. I think Ryan Baker was the lead on that and has continued to drive that community forward. The learning analytics community, or the Society for Learning Analytics Research, as we named it more recently, has been around for 6 years now. And a lot of our attention has been essentially on trying to make use of the data that's generated as learners engage in the learning process, and to be able to use that in ways that allow us to improve or optimize learning, but also improve the environment in which learning happens and the practices that we engage in when we're involved in some kind of a learning activity. The sort of documentation, at least on what we do with learning analytics, or in this case, this is based on a paper by Baker and Yassif that looked more from an educational data mining perspective, but there's a lot of similarity and overlap. This is a classic paper from Baker and Yassif that looked at the specific activities of analysis that are engaged in when you're involved in an interaction process. Bienkowski and colleagues wrote an article in 2012, or a report, I guess more accurately, that also looked at what happens, what are the behavioral or the analytic activities or application elements that are involved as you're engaged in using data that's generated through an educational process in order to better understand what's happening. And so whether we're looking at more of the slightly technical view of the specifics of clustering and relationship mining or discovery with models, or more at the application end where it's about creating profiles of learners, analyzing trends, personalization, adaptation, it's become quite clear that is a significant component to how we're starting to understand learning. I broke it out into a series of two particular categories. One is the technique approach in an American behavioral scientist paper a couple of years ago, one that looked at the behavioral or the techniques around modeling, relationship mining, and knowledge domain modeling and development. So these were techniques in the specific applications which looked at structural analysis, personalized adaptive learning, or trend analysis, and eventually prediction. But regardless of the particular frameworks, the Baker and Yassif, the Bienkowski et al., or the one that I did in ABS, the general view is, wow, we got this data and we're doing neat stuff with it, even though the data is limited in scope. But here's where the problem comes in. That right now, almost all of the analytics activities, if you look at the Baker and Yassif model, for example, you're going to do that type of learning analytics work or that kind of data mining work, you'll have to shift between multiple tool sets, because these tools don't play nicely with each other. It almost feels more like that space that we had, those of you around in the late 90s or early 2000s, when the LMS space was really a disaster zone. As number of different providers were vying for it, there was no clear set of what this would look like. And so it was a pretty complex time in the learning management space. Now, rather than fostering a mindset of modeling learning spaces on the structure of the internet, there was, as administrators are wont to do, there was a heavy push to creating systems and buying systems that were closed spaces that enabled a high degree of control and that served the institution, but not necessarily the learner or not necessarily even the educator that was involved, but it did serve reporting requirements and so on. So we took a path down the LMS space, and then the LMS then became a closed integrated space. There's been a little bit of movement with some approaches through open APIs or through different ways of extending functionality of tool sets or learning management system platforms. But by and large, we can essentially call them still closed spaces and spaces that are intended to serve a system, not the individual learners. And so I'm worried about that, because if data is an asset and if assets are contested economically, which they are, then it starts to become critical that as educators and researchers, we think about where are the points of openness in this education landscape? Where are the points of openness on the analytics tool sets that are being used, rather than proprietary tool sets that, for example, there was an adaptive learning company that recently made the brilliantly, I'm assuming this, I mean, if it was April Fool's, I would have said this works well, but made the statement that they have a mind-reading robot tutor, which to me is like, my goodness, is this the kind of dribble that sells for? I mean, do policymakers buy statements like that, or does anyone give their head a shake and say whoever's making these statements, they're nonsensical? There's no place for this kind of nonsense in the educational space. But unfortunately, this is the mindset that is being promoted by some. But the difficulty is, and I've interacted with the vendor in particular that made the rather comical statement, we don't get a chance to assess what this mind-reading robo-tutor does. We've, on a number of occasions through SOLAR, Society for Learning Analytics Research, requested access to data to be able to validate or evaluate or determine the validity of claims being made. And so that's a challenge that we face, that we are seeing a number of particularly adaptive and personalized learning, which is the holy grail of education on many fronts. At least that's how policymakers and pundits like to think about it. I think social learning and high impact, high engagement learning should be the holy grail of learning, because really personalization and adaptation happens when you don't have ridiculously large classrooms, and also happens when you have high touch environments. So I'm partial to that dimension of it. But even then, just from a perspective to emphasize that these are the challenges that we face, because vendors are coming into the adaptive learning and related spaces offering products and tool sets that we as researchers have absolutely zero opportunity to to evaluate in terms of the accuracy of claims or the specific impact or the way in which contextual changes influence the quality of performance of their systems, whether it's regarding adaptive learning or personalized processes or even just learning performance and learning gains made by individual learners. So my argument, and this was the point of our paper several years ago, is that we need, for lack of a better word, an open analytics platform comparable to Apache or comparable to, let's say, WordPress, where anyone can develop a series of modules and plugins to extend the functionality of the system, but we're able to use or make sense of or extend the functionality of that, as long as we're writing it according to some established APIs or some established guidelines for plugins. So that was our vision, the open learning analytics architecture. And essentially, this is what it is. It's an open extensible platform where a range of individuals and stakeholders can perform a range of analytics functionality that relate to education and learning. We emphasize this as having a number of variables or requiring a number of principles that would function. So first of all, algorithms should be open. We can't overlook the fact that what might work well for a student of a certain race in a certain culture may not work for someone in a different region or different part of the world or different values and different cultures. So when we have an algorithm that says this is how this student should learn math or this is how this student should learn a particular language concept, we need to ensure that we aren't biasing that algorithm to who or how we function or how we think and value. It may be completely different in other regions. Also, I'm personally a huge believer that a student should see exactly what the organization sees. It's just a function of transparency. And partly, really, that's just a principle, but it's also a really good pedagogical dimension. Namely, if students are able to see their data and the trend lines and the predictions being built on their data, you also have the prospect of increasing self-regulation, which really is sort of the ultimate goal as we get involved with learning in general. Is we want to move learners to a point of self-control, self-regulation, so that they're able to learn for themselves rather than relying on the learning that we provide for the individual student. As well, the analytics engine should be seen as a platform. And I quite want to emphasize that the value or the need for this is that as a platform, the ability for us to build on the functionality and take advantage of the work being done by a number of analytics researchers or a number of academics or even a number of organizations starts to have an amplification effect, much like not having to rewrite core functionality of Apache allows you to take advantage of the work of others, but extend it with your particular innovation or whatever you're doing. And then a few other things I'm not going to get into great detail on numbers 4 to 6, but the general point or the principles of the system is what we're advocating for. So initially we described it as something like this. You have a central analytics engine. These are the open components, the gray shaded areas. So you have your adaptive and your personalized engine, you have your intervention engine, you have your analytics engine. And then from there, you can pull a number of things from a number of spaces. You can work with publishers to bring content in, you can host it or host parts of it in an LMS, you can use social technologies, the web, whatever it is that you're doing, and more actually physical world data. I think ambient computing and wearables are, not surprisingly, where everything is going to trend, and mobile learning, which has been around for over a decade from a publication and a research end, but mobile learning is very quickly going to be trumped by wearables. And those of you doing your PhD, do it in wearables because it's going to be very topical and relevant. But so these are some elements, and then the point on the top right is the learning profiles, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And so this is the vision then roughly in terms of what happens. We have a number of tool sets built in. So let's say you're doing network analysis. Well, as long as you're the development of your tool set as a researcher, let's say you get a nice NSF grant and you want to incorporate the work that's being done by a broader learning analytics community globally, you would then develop the analysis functionality that you're creating to basically function within the established guidelines of the analytics engine. So social network analysis, you could add it as a plugin as easily as you can add a plugin to WordPress if you want to add commenting features or if you want to add spam reduction or whatever it is that you want to do. Same thing with any of the other approaches. That any tool set that someone builds that looks at educational data, if you can create it according to the core functionality or the sort of descriptors or the conditions, the APIs that would need to interact with, bring data in or pull data out of the analytics engine, then you can start to amplify the work of others by sharing your work to it. Two other elements, I'm just rushing a little bit because of my time, are obviously how to map and identify content, semantic content. I do think competency-based or open models of competency frameworks need to happen. We've moved from open content to or content as a value point in many cases for publishers now to competencies as the value point. So that's the overlay, and that layer needs to be opened up as well. And then, of course, intervention is anything from your intervention models or how you trigger a particular intervention and so on. That's the model. That's an open learning analytics model. I think this is a critical platform for us retaining control of education, because data is what's informing decision making. And if we're largely farming out our engagement with data to a series of vendors, it's fine. We need to build capacity with vendors, but we do need to have the ability to know what's actually happening under the hood. And we also need to have the ability to understand how we can improve the algorithms, or how we can improve the intervention triggering mechanisms that allow us to support students, and also that enable us to make it culturally relevant and to make it relevant to different school systems that have different types of learner profiles. That's the open learning analytics architecture. The second point I want to, and this is quite brief, but it's a personal learning graphs together with Dragan Gasovich from University of Edinburgh and Ryan Baker and I. We did a talk at the International Educational Data Mining Society's annual conference at EDM in Madrid earlier this year. Essentially, we look at Pledge, similar kind of a concept, but that it is a learner-owned profile that allows individuals to see where they're learning and what they're doing. And the institutions also to understand learner progress. So we defined 4 particular elements, and there's a couple of grants that we're working on with this right now to flesh this out. We expect that within the next offering of the Data Analytics and Learning Mooc that we'll do on edX, or mid next year, that we will have an active pledge model, like the personal learning graph model, to make available to students so they can understand their progress cognitively, which is primarily what we've defined education to be, cognitive advancement. But it's obviously much more. There relates to process and related strategies that individuals engage in to manage and regulate their learning. Some of these can be very effective, but they can also be maladaptive. So in certain instances, a student may actually be engaging in activities that reduce their successful performance from a learning end. So it's being able to signal back to the learner things that they might not be aware about process and strategy and goal-setting behavior. We also want to identify the ways in which affect and engagement influences learner performance. How do different learners become engaged? How do they become disengaged? How does mind wandering arise, and so on? And to understand sort of the affective dimension of the learning process, how emotions and related functions interact. And then the fourth part of the learning graph is the social dimension, how social interactions occur and the impact of those social interactions on process, strategy, affect, engagement, and cognition as well. So I think from a broad overview, this is what we're intending to see. We visualize this as being an open model as well, where researchers can look at a core view of what's happening in learning, and we have the different conditions and the operators defined linked to outcomes so that we can do a better job of understanding what a learner knows, and the learner can also see what they know. And the reason I think something like Pledge is important is that we're definitely in a different setting today economically and career-wise than we've been in the past in terms of work particularly. If we are to believe the reports about automation and the changing labor market, we have a postdoc at Link that's looking specifically at the labor market transitions and how they impact universities. So if we are to believe what's happening or what the pundits are saying and the reports being produced by government and consulting agencies, then we're going to see huge sectors of the economy automate in terms of employment. And that means that a lot of individuals, instead of having a traditional 4-year relationship with the university, are going to have something like a 40-year relationship with the university, which means they're going to come back and reskill. Let's say they might do work in evenings and weekends online, but periodically, if their entire labor market disappears or the field that they're in, it may be time to return to the university to complete a certificate in machine learning or whatever else is the current trend at that particular time. So by doing a better job of modeling what a learner knows and understanding what they know cognitively, as well as the affect, the social, and the process components, essentially Pledge would be the equivalent of you as a university or you as a student enroll in a university, and you share those elements of your graph that are relevant to that university related to process and cognition, and then that allows them to personalize and adapt specific learning activities for you. So it may have been a 2-year certificate in the past, maybe a 6-month certificate, because it's taking account of the knowledge that you've acquired as you've been involved in learning and related activities. A few other aspects as well that you're all familiar with, but it's the idea of learning across the spectrum of life, and then also the pedagogical value of integrated and immersive learning, as well as the move towards personalized and adaptive learning. That's essentially it. So my argument then in a nutshell, as I'm now about I've got a minute left. So the argument in a nutshell then basically is that we need a platform that is open, that opens up the analytics activity that a growing number of researchers are engaged in who have an education affiliation. That needs to be treated as a platform so we can amplify one another's work and make sure that we own the asset that's becoming so central in a digital economy, namely data and the analysis of that data. Second, that we similarly need an open learner profile where we can know and understand what a student knows. So as a student, and it needs to be student owned. So as they move in and out of a university system, in and out of a workplace setting, in and out of a school system, whatever they're doing, boot camps or whatever else, that there's an ability for them to continue upgrading their learning graphs so that it's easier for organizations to understand if this is the right match for them, but also easier for the learner to return to university, upgrade, reskill, enter the labor market, continue to develop their skills, return to universities, upgrade, reskill, and so on.